Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms, presented by Diligent Institute, your source for the latest and greatest in corporate governance, all in 10 minutes. I'm Lisa Edwards, Executive Chair of Diligent Institute and host of the show. Paul DeNicola is with me today. We've always had such interesting and robust discussions with Paul, who, as principal of PwC's Governance Insight Center, really has his finger on the pulse of governance. Thank you for being here today with us, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, let's jump right in. People are starting to get into the flow of 2024, finally. And I want to talk about a report that you recently published on the biggest governance trends that will shape 2024. Specifically, you mentioned 5 trends to watch. The first 3 of those are a fraught geopolitical environment, which I think is only getting more fraught, the rising prominence of what you call ESG economics, and rising shareholder activism. So could you just take us through those and maybe expand on each of those a little bit for us?
Sure. Let me hit those briefly. So maybe the place to begin is with the geopolitical environment. We clearly expect that there is an unstable national and global economic and political environment, and that's going to create really a greater sense of uncertainty. These geopolitical tensions are going to persist with the impacts of the war in Ukraine, the events in Israel and Gaza lingering, and violence flaring around the globe. At the same time, you have populist political leaders' recent electoral successes, and that suggests perhaps that there's an ongoing public concern over issues like immigration and safety, even as climate change and weather events force population migrations. So that's your backdrop. And against that backdrop of sort of global economic instability, companies are going to unavoidably have to adjust their approach to strategy. The question remains, though, how do leaders strategize and plan in that kind of environment? So we're seeing management teams look into things like scenario modeling to help really get at the risks and prepare as best as possible, especially in light of the fact that we have an election in the U.S., a presidential election in the U.S. coming up in November. And leaders are really going to have to consider what types of risks and opportunities that can arise in the different types of economic situations that I described, with potential trade wars, environmental issues affecting the availability and cost of raw materials, energy, and labor. So what should boards be thinking about there? They should really be working to understand the various potential impacts on their business operations of this geopolitical uncertainty, whether it's supply chain or employee safety, and really making sure that their management team is adopting strategies to mitigate risk and ensure resiliency. And they'll want to be comfortable that they're discussing current national and global trends and events, and importantly, considering how these trends may affect their strategy.
Yeah, it's funny. I just to comment on that one. It's for the first time I'm hearing at the board level conversations about domestic violence and domestic politics. And I think it's a really good call out by you and the PwC team, because I don't know that we've ever had to deal with this stuff before in the same way. It's always been taken as a given that we have sort of this level of domestic stability, and then there's all these other things happening in the background. And now it's sort of like added to the list. It's all of it.
I would guess, the second trend that you mentioned is what we call sort of the rising prominence of ESG economics. And, if you look back over the past 2 years or so, the discussion on compliance has driven most of the sustainability discussions that are being had at companies. But level into that, CSRD in Europe, the first 2 standards from the ISSB, California's climate reporting legislation, not to mention planning around the SEC's climate disclosure rule. That's generated a lot of focus on the measurement of sustainability impacts, and new processes need to report them. But the term ESG has become very much politicized, right? But regardless of whether the terminology of ESG has become the target for activists and those in office, business leaders can't minimize how climate, human capital affects supply chains, customer bases, and the availability of materials. So the trend we see is that sustainability has increasingly been viewed as through the lens of the impact on the bottom line. And so we see boards shifting from just having a regulatory focus to asking management what steps the company is taking towards sustainability and how those steps will impact the business. So for forward-looking companies, the board's responsibility is really increasingly to ensure that management is considering the costs of executing against the commitments that they're making, taking into account related risks throughout the value chain and focusing on the economic impact. So I would say the takeaways for the board on this would be really asking pointed, specific financial questions. Where is the capital for ESG initiatives coming from? What's the ROI on individual programs? And might alternatives have a greater impact? And finally, what kind of technology or other investments are needed for the company to become truly sustainable? So, more regulations and disclosure are pending, but boards need to continue to focus on the impact on the business.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? At the same time that the term has become more politicized, the actual accounting, if you will, for those components of particularly climate have become more mainstream and is starting to get incorporated into. It is simply another risk of the company that is, front and center as we look at some of the climate impact, water, everything else. So it's there's kind of a duality to what's going on there a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And your last one was shareholder activism. Talk about that one a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, the headlines might be smaller and less frequent, but activist shareholders are initiating actions at this point. The data shows that sort of pre-COVID levels, and added to the complexity there, obviously, is universal proxy, which has created sort of general uncertainty for boards and giving activists, in many cases, opportunities and leverage. The early experience has shown that activists can win concessions and even board seats by approaching the company in this manner. I think the bottom line is that boards can't entirely abandon their pre-universal proxy playbook, but they do need to refresh that. And while we don't know exactly what steps are going to be taken in the coming months, we'll be watching really first quarter of 2024 when a lot of the notice provisions require dissidents to announce campaigns. And we'll be looking to see really how other investors respond to the pattern of increased settlement. I'd say there are a couple of takeaways for the board. Um, a tabletop exercise is one approach, but boards should continue to practice of being their own activists, working with management to understand the strategy in the context of the alternatives available, and continuing the proactive engagement with shareholders. And then really thinking about how boards can use the process of self assessment or self evaluation as an opportunity to really build the case for each individual director's contributions before the arrival of an activist, especially when individual assessments are in fact included.
The other two trends that you note are this integration of strategy and risk governance. And it's as I'm saying it, it's almost striking me how much these things they're sort of interrelated and they're sort of entwined together. Like you can't really tease some of these apart. But this integration of strategy and risk governance, and then kind of related to that, the focusing on board culture. So, what are you seeing companies doing in 2024 as it relates to those two items?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with the integration of strategy and risk governance. So all of the threats that we've spoken about briefly and more, right, are changing that risk landscape and more rapidly and more dramatically than ever. At the same time, companies face the interconnectedness or the interconnected catalog of breakthrough technologies and situations that really blend risk and opportunity, from climate change to natural disasters to generative AI, right? So it's a wide swath here. Board members really need to understand how the velocity uh, of events today can impact and compound those risks, both at the enterprise level, whether or not they are controllable. And boards really need to think about how they can interrogate the company's organizational and leadership structure. Are management capabilities robust enough to adequately protect and create strategic value? Um, and there's the opportunity side of this too. So boards can really look to add value by identifying strategic opportunities within the crisis to really change the mindset or shift the mindset from defensive to offensive. On on the topic of board culture, this is one that I'm particularly interested in. Um, you can have a board of 8 or 10 or 12 really smart and experienced folks from diverse backgrounds, but still not have a board culture that is effective and really prompts effective oversight. So all these developments that we're talking about and all these trends, they're sufficient to fill any agenda for the year ahead. But it really doesn't matter what topics are being discussed if board members can't function effectively having those conversations. As some of the risks and opportunities expand and multiply, culture and communication at the board level, really elevating board performance, is increasingly key to good governance. Effective oversight and keeping pace with regulatory and technological changes require boards really to be able to make informed, considered decisions that draw on a full range of views and experience. And that means that boards have to look at their own culture. Are they succeeding in productively tapping into their own wealth of expertise to raise the right questions? Are they okay voicing a dissenting view in the boardroom? Or is consensus and collegiality the only thing at which is being driven? So I think that revisiting this topic of what the board's culture is and how to think about becoming a more effective board by looking at it through the lens of culture.
Yeah, so we'll wrap it mostly there. I'd like to come back to you with one last quick thought, but it sounds like you're sort of saying, look, boards need to do self-evaluations, they need to do continuous education, and back to your your risk management and global landscape probably should be doing tabletop exercise type things. And I heard somebody say recently, if the first time you're testing your crisis management plan is during the middle of a crisis, whether that's an activist coming in or a climate issue or a geopolitical issue, you probably are not going to do as well as you could. So let's wrap it up with maybe final thoughts on how the audience can keep up with all of these trends in 2024, and he's just sort of a little bit of practical advice.
Yeah, no, I think that the number of topics that board members have to keep up with has greatly expanded, which has made part of a director's job description to stay continually educated, and you can get that through many different ways, from the management team, from director education programs, from third-party advisors, but really figuring out and prioritizing what the most important topics are to the company that are impacting the company strategy, and how does the board get up to speed on all of those topics in a continuous learning fashion.
We will wrap it there for this episode. Thank you so much, Paul, for giving us such a great recap. I recommend that you check out that full report, which is available on PwC Governance Insight Center website. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.